The content of this episode is for informational and educational purposes only and reflects the opinions and research of the host, contributors, and guests. While every effort has been made to ensure the accuracy of the information presented, the producers of Varied Voices make no guarantees regarding its completeness or reliability. The statements, testimonials, and correspondences discussed in this episode are based on publicly available information, personal interviews, and personal correspondence. Any references to individuals, organizations, or entities are based on facts at the time of recording and are not intended to defame, disparage, or harm their reputation. This episode may include graphic content, opinions, and interpretations that some listeners may find distressing. Listener discretion is advised. The views expressed by guests and contributors are their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the producers or hosts of Varied Voices. The producers and hosts assume no responsibility or liability for actions taken by listeners based on the content of this episode. Listeners are encouraged to do their own research and consult with appropriate professionals if they seek legal, psychological, or other expert advice. I actually first heard about this case from a different Vero Beach local, and it was echoed in another local. So this is a story that has kind of reverberated and echoed through the decades in Vero, and it obviously affected many and left a terrible impression. But then when you and I got to talking and you gave me a lot more detail about the case because you were more familiar with it around the time when it happened.
Right. I moved here in 1977 at the age of 15. So, these were my running, grounds as a young girl coming into teenhood and becoming a teenager and going to high school. Little did I know that there were hunters among us.
Right, and so these were your peers in some ways that were affected.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And any of us could have been a victim to them.
Right, and Vero just has this image of being such a sleepy, coastal, wholesome town, but of course, it's always those places that might be the ones harboring monsters. So can you tell me about what you did in more recent time, what you did to research this case?
Right. Well, these were homegrown serial killers, so to speak, in Vero Beach, Florida. And you're right. When I moved here in 77, there was one high school. There wasn't a mall at the time. It came in, I think, my junior year, and they brought the band out and everything. So it was a sleepy little citrus town. And these cousins were born here and lived here, and their families, I think, still live here today. But yes, it touched me back then because even back then I was intrigued by true crime. And this happened in basically my back door. So yes, I wanted to do the Waterfield Gore case. A lot of tragedies happened here in Indian River County and other parts of Florida because of these killer cousins. And so I was intrigued to know more. So what I did to begin with, I think you and I both started listening to podcasts, which basically just regurgitated, what journalists had wrote about after the cousins had been captured in 1983. But I came across a podcast out of Las Vegas called Murder Phone Podcast by Tony Cielo and his father. And Tony Cielo he had brain trauma like when he was 14 or something like that. And a neuroscientist said that he had the brain where the damage was in his brain was of that of a serial killer. So for therapy for himself, he started to reach out to serial killers and write to them, one being David Alan Gore. So I started reading these letters that David Alan Gore had written to Tony Cielo, and they were horrifying. I mean, I listen to a lot of true crime, but this affected my sleep, and it was quite horrible. And as I've continued to do a deep dive into this case, what I've realized after listening to Murder Phone Podcast is that David Alan Gore, in my opinion, was grandiosing because we don't know what Tony wrote to him, making him think that Tony wanted to hear these graphic, gory details, no pun intended. And also, there was the case that caught him. He's told us this 3 different ways. So right away, you realize he's grandiose. And he also talked about friending Ted Bundy. And, Ted Bundy, they all look up to him, it seems like. But him and Ted Bundy used to sit and compare stories. I really don't believe that. Another thing that debunked it for me was a horrible murder that he described of a 15-year-old girl by the name of Missy. And she lived in a nearby town of Vero Beach. in 1976. Supposedly, Fred Waterfield picked her up and had given her a ride before, so she was familiar with him, picked her up, brought her, and then they ambushed her at David Allen Gore's trailer. And then he goes on to talk about how he tortured her for like a day or two, and it was horrible. And he said that the parents had reported her missing. So immediately I contacted Lieutenant Michael Pierce and said, we can connect the dots here because she would be in the juvenile, missing juvenile list, and that never goes away. If they haven't caught him, it's still there. She isn't. She was never reported missing. So I don't believe she existed. I believe it was another fantasy that David Gore told Tony Cielo because he knew he wanted to hear these things, or he thought he did. So that I kind of pushed aside and I dove on into the deep dive to get more and more information. I wrote to Fred Waterfield, and his correspondence surprised me. He's very intelligent. And of course, I will be sharing our correspondence. As you know, this is Varied Voices podcast, and I think it's important that we hear all sides. But we will also be listening to survivors, and there are 3 and an alleged 4th survivor, and they are going to tell their stories in their own words as to what happened to them and how they escaped from being murdered. And then we are going to have a guest that I'm very excited to have. It's Dr. Catherine Ramsland. She's a PhD and has studied serial killers throughout her long career. She is the author of the #1 bestseller, Confessions of a Serial Killer, about Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. And I think that she will give us a lot of insights into a mind of a serial killer. And maybe I think one thing that draws crime enthusiasts is we wonder what makes these people tick. And for me, I think it's because, anything that scares me, I kind of lean into and I want to know more about, because I think that the more tools that I have, maybe the more protected I'll be. I don't know that that's necessarily true, but that is my motive.
Yeah, I can understand that. There's an urge to understand why, because if you understand why, then in some way you have some control over the situation that is inherently uncontrollable.
Correct. Absolutely. Well, so we're going to start out. I have got David Allen Gore's testimony from Fred Waterfield's trial. And I also have David Allen Gore's testimony from his trial. And I think that they align, which is completely different than Murder Phone podcast. They align. They were the actual testimony at the trial. And I think at that time, you're looking at a scared David Allen Gore, knowing that he's been caught red-handed. And that is one thing that I read in one of the detective's reports, that he says, I got to get this off my chest. So I think that these are the actual events, as close as we're going to get. As a true crime enthusiast, I would want to have it from the killer's words if I could.
So who were the Lings? They were a family that emigrated to America in the early 1980s. So they had settled in the rural outskirts of Vero Beach.
So they were living in a grove where these cousins were doing a lot of their rapes and killings, unfortunately.
Exactly. And so they had just moved to Vero for what most immigrants move to America for, or other places, the promise of a peaceful life and, financial success. So first we have Xiang Huang Ling. She was a 48, a devoted wife and mother supporting her husband, Pu Ling. And Pu worked as an inspector at the local fruit packing plant, which is why, citrus town, Vero Beach. That's why they were here. Pu Ling had emigrated with his family, including a son from Taiwan, to Florida. And their daughter, Ying Hua Ling, who was 17, was a very bright and promising student at Vero Beach High School, known for exceptional talents in math. And overall, her academic achievements had earned her recognition and awards, and she had a bright future ahead of her.
Right. It was very sad.
And did you happen to know Ying Hua Ling?
Yeah, I didn't really know her, but I do remember her. I remember in 81, I was in college, and when this story came out, I thought about it, and I had seen her. She was very quiet, and she would have been 2 years younger than me. And it just, I do think that I knew who she was, which, just even made it just more real.
Yeah.
This happened in Vero Beach, where I grew up, where I went to high school.
Yeah, so you knew of her while you were in high school.
I remember seeing her face, yeah.
On February 19th, 1981, 17-year-old Yang, she stepped off the school bus and unfortunately never made it home.
No, that's where she, I guess David Gore had seen her like a day or so before get off the school bus. And he started to watch the house. And so he followed her that day because he had seen her before.
So he was just first keeping an eye on the victim, seeing maybe where she went home, if she was with anyone.
Right. I think it's important, Stephanie, at this point, to talk about what David Alan Gore's motive was. And what we've learned from the transcripts is that David had, I guess Waterfield had asked him if he was serious about making money. And he gave him a proposition that he could make money if he would basically get young girls for Waterfield, and he would pay him $1,000 a girl. So on this particular day, that's what this was his first, as far as we know, his first victim. He spotted her and started to, I guess, spy on the family. And
right, he was stalking his victim.
Correct.
So on this afternoon, as Ying was walking home from school, David Alan Gore approached her. So he approached her with his auxiliary badge and said he had a case he needed to talk to her about. And of course, being a 17-year-old girl, you're probably freaked out. You trust that this is actual police. And so she complied and went with him. But she had something to tell her mom. She had to go home, she said.
She had to go home and she had to tell her mother. And so they went back to the Ling house, and he knocked on the door, and they went inside, and he confronted Mrs. Ling, saying that they needed to come down to the station and he needed to conduct an interview with them. And she was like, well, what is this about? And he says, well, you need to come with me. And so she complied. They believed what he said, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they were just scared more than anything.
Right. They really did believe that he was an officer of the law.
So he abducts both of them.
Right. He handcuffs both of them together, side by side.
So initially, it was really just to get the young girl for Fred. But because the mother was involved, he handcuffs her as well. Now they're handcuffed together. He puts them in his truck.
Right. He puts them in the truck. So yes, he went back to where he worked to make the call to Fred Waterfield that he had a package.
Right. So Fred Waterfield is in Orlando at this time. He's like, all right, I will be there. He drives over to Vero.
Right. So Fred Waterfield had a mechanic shop over there in Orlando. And so, yes, he makes arrangements to close up early and to come over to Vero to collect the package.
Which is at a grove out by I-95 and Route 60.
Yeah, he met him at I think, where you get off at 95 and 60, and then followed him back to the Grove where they could, have privacy to do the exchange.
So while Gore is waiting for Waterfield, he sexually assaults both of the women.
Right. He says he didn't rape them. He didn't have time to. He was afraid he'd be discovered, but he sexually assaulted both women. He had time as he was waiting for Waterfield to get there, which was about a 2-hour drive. And so he said that he fondled them and sexually assaulted them, but did not rape them because he was afraid that somebody would come upon him. So he wanted to keep an eye out.
And then at this point, eventually Fred shows up to collect his package.
Right. And he was not happy with the mother being there. From what David Alan Gore says about his cousin is he had a type. He liked them young, and he liked them petite, and he was very upset that he had an older woman there and the mother. So he expressed that to his cousin. So after that, he tied up the mother in a way that I guess you could say would be hog tying, so that every time the mother moved, it choked her more.
And then he placed her in the back seat, like on the floorboard.
Well, he actually assaulted her daughter. And so I say this, and because as a mother, I cannot think of the worst case scenario happening to me is to see somebody hurting my child and I can't do anything about it. So that hits me hard when I read about this. And once again, I think that it speaks to the lack of empathy, the sociopathic nature of their personalities, that they could do something like that. And furthermore, I think it's important to state that they were both fathers.
That blows my mind.
Right. So David Gore had 2 sons, but then Fred Waterfield had twin daughters, and he's doing this. And they had to be close to the same age as Ling.
So yes, the mother's in a hog tie. Gore notices that her face is turning blue as she's struggling and has this rope around her neck and her body, but she's just put to the side and to be killed later.
Right. And then they moved her into a homemade wooden toolbox on the back of Gore's truck. And the daughter was put on the floorboard, and he left, or did he put them both in the...
He rapes her again. I know that he said Fred rapes her twice.
And then he leaves with her. And somewhere along the way, he contacted David Gore to dispose of the bodies, which were already dismembered and put into drums.
Then David goes home and asks his wife, who we don't really know if she knows anything or not.
Well, the story was, and some of the research that I did, is that he had made her mad. And he took the wife, with him over with the backhoe and thought about offing his wife, and then didn't do it. And the wife tells that story to the police as well, that she was with him when he dug those holes.
Oh, okay. In this statement, he mentions that he gets the wife to take him over so that he can take the backhoe over to the site to dig holes for the Lings. But before he does that, he drives the wife back home and then goes back to the site just so that he'd have a...
Yeah. And I've done so much research on this. So some of it was Murder Phone podcast, where I heard him talk about, he thought about doing his wife as well. And it was at that time. Now, whether it was on the Murder Phone podcast or through all of the, files that I've gone through, I'm not sure. And then I know that they did interview the wife, and I thought, was there when he dug those holes. But she didn't know what they were for, but she could be able to testify about that.
I guess she didn't get too close, because when they were getting the drums in...
Oh, no, she didn't see any drums. This was just the hole being dug before Waterfield brought the bodies back. Whatever Waterfield did, he basically dismembered the bodies, put them in. Gore said one of the drums opened, and he saw body parts.
Yeah, he said he saw a leg pop out, but then... So David made an attempt to seal the drums before they were burying them, and... How exactly? That wasn't clear with this. Like, he squished them down with...
Yeah, there was... Right. It was very disturbing. Again, with, just the lack of empathy. It's just the sociopathic nature of these minds, and that they're just nothing more than objects, and there's no feeling. And I think that when you hear this, and one reason that you and I are telling the story as opposed to reading it from Gore's own words, is it's just too graphic and too horrible to do from the mouth of a serial killer. So you and I talking about this, of course, we have empathy, and it's disgusts us, and we try to understand, which is the reason that a lot of, like I said before, the true crimers want to know why do these people, why are they the way they are? And then they just go about business. They go home to their wife, to their children. Can you imagine being married to that and finding that out later? And then some people, try to say it didn't happen, which is baffling to me. I would want to know. I would want to look at the facts and the truth. And all we're doing here as podcasters is reviewing the facts. It's going to be up to anybody listening to draw their own conclusions. These are just what we have in transcripts and, of course, survivors. All we're doing is bringing the facts as we know them, as it's been told. So now it's July 15th, and we're going to tell you about their next victim, which is Judith K. Daly. So Judith K. Daly was visiting from California, visiting her sister, and her and her daughter and a daughter's friend wanted to go to the beach. So she took the daughter and the daughter's friend to JC Beach and dropped them off. Then she went back to Round Island for some alone time and to read her book. And she was sunbathing on the beach, reading her book, but she was being watched.
Right. She was being watched through binoculars by a predator.
Right.
And he figured it was her car. She was the only one there, only car there. So he decided to just keep an eye on her and see how long she'd be there. And in the meantime, he messed with her car. He, unhooked
something in the engine so it wouldn't start.
Exactly.
Yes. So then Judith K. Daly came walking up and was ready to leave, and she gets in her car and it doesn't start. And then lo and behold, here comes David Gore, and she asks, "Can you help me?"
Right, at the perfect timing, because he knew just when to turn around and come back and make it seem like, oh, I just happened to be here.
Right. So he fiddled with the engine, got in, tried to start the car again. Oh, it's your starter. It won't start. And she says, "Oh, well, can you make a phone call for me?"
So he says, yeah, sure. Let's go there's a 7-Eleven up the street, which would have been like a 5 or 10 minute drive away. And she gets in with him. And as soon as she does, he puts handcuffs on her, takes a gun out on her.
Right. Tells her not to make any moves or, say anything. And they drive through town and she keeps quiet. And he drives to a phone booth where he calls Freddie Waterfield, his cousin. And he says, "I have a package that I think you'll like."
She doesn't necessarily keep quiet because she's freaking out about her daughters. And she's like, "Can you call someone to pick up my daughters?" And he's like, "Oh shit, yeah, I gotta help that out."
Okay, so from the transcript, there's a little phone booth and she was on her way. Freddie was going to make a call. She kept saying, "My daughters were at JC Beach and I'm overdue to pick them up. And could you?" So I was thinking up a story to give to them that I could do to prevent her daughters from suspecting anything. So this is from David Allen Gore's transcript at the Waterfield trial. So I asked her what the number was that I could call and send somebody to get her daughters. And she gave me this number and the guy, and I think his name was Paul. Anyways, I stopped there to call, and I called him and told this man that Judy K. Daly, her car broke down on Wabasso Beach. So he told her the exact opposite end of the county than where it was, down one of the roads, and she needed someone to pick up her daughters and also some help to get the car. And so when I hung up from her, I called Freddie Waterfield at the shop and told him, I said, "You know that girl, that blonde that you was wanting?" I said, "I got a package for you." He said, "Okay." And I said, "Well, why don't you meet me as soon as possible as you can?" He said, "Well, I'll close up the shop about 3:34 and I'll come over." Wow. So that was David Allen Gore's words at the testimony this was the testimony of David Allen Gore's trial, sworn statement. So those were his words about that day. So then Freddie comes over and follows him back to the Groves where they have Judith K. Daly.
And in the meantime, he does the same thing he did with the Langs because he's waiting for Fred to come over from Orlando. He takes her clothes off, rips them off because she's tied up still in handcuffs, and he molests her.
Right.
And then Fred gets there, and they go through the same routine again.
Yeah, same routine. And Fred Waterfield puts her in the floorboard of the truck, leaves with her. She's never seen again. And from what David Allen Gore said was that Freddie Waterfield told him that he fed her to the alligators, the body to the alligators, and that she was gone.
So I guess summer was a super busy time.
Very busy, and they weren't done.
No.
So the next thing that happened was David Allen Gore goes on the hunt again, looking for Freddie Waterfield's type. And he sees this lady at the doctor's clinic, in the parking lot of the doctor's clinic. And he watches her get out of the car and go into the doctor's clinic. So he takes a rape kit, basically. He had all the makings of a rape kit he had a gun. He even brought his vodka along. He had a jar full of vodka. And he was in the back seat of her car. And as she was coming out, she spotted him. And there was actually a sheriff's deputy at the doctor's clinic at that time for some reason. And she went up to him. She goes, "There is a guy in the back of my car." And so they arrested him. They caught him. And he had his auxiliary badge still. Now, why did he have that? But anyways, there he was in the back seat of the car, and they got him. And he was arrested, and he was convicted, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. So this, again, is July 1981. But he gets out in 1982 or 83, let's say 81, 82. He got out in 1983 when it all started all over again.
So now at this point in the story, David Allen Gore is finally incarcerated between July 31st, 1981, and
he's released
to March 15th, 1983, which, in my opinion, was not nearly enough time.
Unfortunately.
He is released, exactly. And it doesn't even take that long between his release in March for them to start back at it again.
Right, starting their hunting. They had to take Freddie's girlfriend, Mary, to the airport, who was flying to Europe. And so they drove down there, the three of them, to Miami. So now they're going down to Miami. They drop off Mary. And Fred says, well, why don't we go into Miami and see if we can't find a girl to pick up? So they're on the hunt again.
They find some attractive female, long brown hair, as David describes her. She's driving around in a Camaro, and they follow her for a while. But they decide that it's too busy out, and it just becomes too much of an
Miami.
effort.
They're not used to the big city.
Exactly. So thankfully, they decide to drop it and just head back to Vero. So no one was killed that night.
Thank goodness. Busy, busy guys.
So on May 20th of that year, we pick up the hunt story.
Right. And his girlfriend, so Waterfield had a girlfriend that went out of town to Tampa, and they thought it would be a good time to go hunting women.
So she was away, and so David and Fred decided to go to Daytona to hunt for hookers specifically.
Was it Daytona or Orlando where he had a business? Oh, they went to Daytona. He, I guess, was familiar with the hookers in Daytona.
So David and Fred decide to go to Daytona to hunt specifically for prostitutes.
What'd they take with them?
They took a rape kit. They had handcuffs and rope and other necessary things.
Gun?
Definitely a gun. But they drove up and down the streets of Daytona for several hours.
What were they in? They had a client's van. Right. But they were in a van, and they had it decked out for hunting women with rape kit.
And they drive up and down the streets of Daytona and unfortunately, but fortunately, find nobody. So Fred goes, well, I know all the hot spots in Orlando. Let's go there.
Okay, that's where they got to Orlando.
Exactly. And they leave Daytona. This is like around 11 o'clock at night, late May, early June, sometime around then. And they keep their hunt going to several hours away over to Orlando, where they do find a prostitute, and she's willing to go into the van.
Right. And I just wonder if they knew that there was a second man in that van, if she knew there was a second man in that van, because didn't she have a reservation about going to the back of the van?
Right. I mean, I guess who wouldn't? But yes, she was very suspicious of them. She did not want to go in the back. She wanted to sit in the passenger seat. So they complied. And thanks to that move, she was able to jump out of the van. They both held her down as they were driving, which must have been just chaos. But thankfully, she was able to get away.
Yeah. She jumped out, and then they decided, well, let's call it a night. I'm sure she's going to call the police. So we need to get out of here.
So they decided to go to Vero. And so this one would be sometime in the middle of the night that night, driving back to Vero. And on the way there...
Yeah, it would have been like 1 or 2, you would think.
On the way there, they find 2 hitchhiking teenagers.
Right, 14 years old. So we have Barbara Ann Byers and Angelica Lavalle decided to go to Fort Lauderdale. And unfortunately, it was a bad decision. They were hitchhiking, and up pulls the killing cousins and offers them a ride.
So these 2 hitchhikers, they get in their van. Terrible decision, right? As with their other routines, Fred tends to be the nice guy, the good cop.
Yeah, they play good guy, bad guy is what Gore said they did.
So he makes some small talk with them. Everything's fine. Everything's chill. Gore's probably just sitting back there like a quiet creep. But not much time passes before David pulls the gun out. And he says that they just kind of froze. Which, of course, right? Like teenagers and they're girls and they're scared.
These creepy guys.
So that one really didn't take much to get them
to comply. Yeah.
So now they're tied down and they lay them down face down on the floor of the van.
And it's at that point that Fred Waterfield goes in the back and starts to assault them.
Yeah, so he starts to take their clothes off.
And so he's assaulting them. And then David Allen Gore says that they need to get gas. So they pulled off there at 95 and 60. So they pull off there. And interesting to know that this receipt from getting gas is what convicted Fred Waterfield and connected him to these 2 murders and got him 2 life sentences. So then at that point, Fred Waterfield says, well, I'm going to take you, it's getting late, I'm going to take you back to the Holiday Inn out west and drop you off to get your car. You can follow me to my shop.
So David picks up his car and he's not too far behind Fred, as he's going to his shop, as he's making his way to his shop, which, by the way, I looked in that area and like there's no shops at all.
Well, there was.
There was at that time, yeah. So I'm just thinking about like the haunted places that exist with these awful things.
You wouldn't want to buy that property, right?
Right.
I feel the same way, Stephanie. I just like bad mojo. I don't know.
Or like thinking of like David's old house where like outside where Lynn Elliott died. Like,
yeah, you know what? I was at a party last night and these people live near there. They have a home built there, and they said there's still a bullet in the tree, which we haven't gotten to that case yet, but it's just, wow. Small town. But anyway, so he follows.
So he's not that far behind him. And once he gets to Fred's shop, he discovers that the teenagers are dead on a mattress. Clothes off, they've been assaulted once more, but they're dead. And David is pissed about that because he didn't get a turn.
Well, and Waterfield's pissed because the gun that he had, which I think was a .22, it misfired. It jammed or something, and it misfired, and that became a thing. But somehow he did shoot him. They had several guns, and in some of the police reports that I read, I think it was Waterfield's wife's father, so it would have been his father-in-law. They had guns go missing, which matched some of these guns. So they had stolen some of those guns. But anyway, so he finds them murdered, and then what did they do? So they did. And we can see which one, but I believe it was Barbara Ann Byers' head, the skull, was found near the drums that the Lings were found, so buried not far from there. Angelica Lavallee, by the way, of Judith K. Daly, and basically from what David Allen Gore said is that Fred fed her to the alligators. So they never found her body. But they did find Barbara's. Yeah, it's such a sad story. These two cousins just did such damage. And, you think about these victims and just how many people's lives that it changed forever.
And just to add to how they see people, and specifically women, as just objects, when they were trying to dispose of their bodies, I guess it must have been Barbara that didn't quite fit in the grave that they built.
That's right. Yeah.
So to solve that, because she wasn't quite fitting
in the size of the grave that they dug,
Fred just pulls out a knife and says, "Oh yeah, let me take care of it," and slices her head off, which they bury separately.
Right, and which is what I believe they found.
Yeah.
Horrible. Okay, so now we get on to our last victim, who is the hero in the story, Lynn Elliott. So July 26, 1983, Lynn Elliott and her friend Regan Martin wanted to go to Wabasso Beach, and they needed a ride, so they just thought they would hitchhike. So Lynn Elliott, being 17 and Regan being 14, decided to hitchhike, go to Wabasso Beach. And on this fateful day, they were picked up by the cousins. David Allen Gore and Fred Waterfield pulled over, picked them up, and they get in between the two of them. And Fred Waterfield says, "Do you all want to go smoke some pot?" And they said, "Sure." He went to get the pot, but the glove box door fell open, which revealed a gun. And at that time,
this says like they went over a bump and the door went open.
So they get in between. Waterfield is driving and Gore is in the passenger side, and the two girls are in the middle. And Waterfield said, "Hey, do you all want to smoke some pot?" And the girls said, "Yeah, why not?"
At this time, David has his gun in the glove box, just knowing that he's going to use it whenever they're ready. And like they always do, or like they often do, Fred is being the talkative guy. He's making small talk with them. He's talking about what he does for a living and his interests, just blah, 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 making them feel at ease.
Good guy, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And during this time, David's thinking about his gun.
So at that point, David pulls the gun on the girls, and Lynn Elliott thinks it's a joke. "You're kidding, right?" And he said, "No, I'm not kidding." And then they proceed to take them to David's parents' house, where David was living and the parents were away. Her testimony was that Waterfield was kind of acting like he was surprised and, the good guy, bad guy routine. And so then they get to David Allen Gore's parents' house, where they tell them, do what we say and nothing will happen to you. And so they go into the house. And at that point, they are handcuffed at this point. They make them bend down and lean over a bed. And then the two of them walk out and are discussing, I guess, what their next moves were going to be. And then they end up separating the two girls. They took Lynn Elliott into another room where it was said that both of them, Waterfield and Gore, sexually assaulted her. Regan Martin was in the other room, and she didn't know exactly what was going on at that point. She could hear Lynn gagging. And then at some point, David Gore came back into the room and proceeded to sexually assault Regan Martin. And at one point, he got angry with her, saying she was no good at it. And then they heard a door shut. And at that point, it was when Lynn Elliott got out of the restraints and was able to get out the front door. And so David ran out into the hallway where Waterfield was at, and Waterfield instructed him, go get her. And David had no clothes on, but he had the gun. And that's why David said that Waterfield told him to do that. Again, this is just all in the transcripts. And he set out after her, and I believe he shot in the air at first, was yelling at her to stop. And then he ran up. I guess she fell. And as he ran up to her, she was screaming, and he shot her. And there was a boy on a bike that saw it. And at this time, during all this stuff that was going on, Waterfield got in his truck and left. And he headed to his office, his mechanic shop, which is where the police ended up finding him and interviewing him, not knowing at that time that he was part of it. It took a little bit of investigating. So at that point, the police were notified. And actually, I think it was Phil Redstone said that he had already been watching Gore because he knew that he was a bad guy. They also suspected him in the murderings of the Lings because they found hair from the Lings in his possession when they got him. They did a search of his car and whatnot and found hair of the Lings when he was picked up and arrested from the Owens case. And so they had been keeping an eye on him. But the mother complained to the governor about being stalked by these deputies, and they were told to stand down, although they did not. And I know it was Phil Redstone and I think Lieutenant White or Detective White. And Fred Redstone was actually cruising by around that time. So they got on the site pretty quick. And at this point, Fred realized that he had been seen. So he called the sheriff's department and said that there was a naked man chasing a woman in the groves near this residence. And so he was trying to deflect the situation. And yes, they did send police that way, but deputies remained on the scene because they pretty much felt that was just to try to get them away, but they were following up on everything. And so they were trying to get him to come out. He had taken Regan Martin, had I believe a knife at her neck and made her go up into the attic, said if she yelled at or said anything, he would kill her. It was very hot up there because it was in July. And, to listen to her rendition of it is so horrifying. But eventually they talked him down. Deputy Williams, who had hunted with the cousins, was there and trying to talk him out. His sister was trying to talk him out. Eventually he came out and they found Regan Martin up in the attic, and they got clothes from the closet, which were Mrs. Gore's, and gave to cover her up and took her to the hospital, where then they interviewed her. And, then they started to realize that there was the cousin involved. And of course, then it went on from there. And they ultimately, needless to say, arrested both the killing cousins for murdering 6 women. Now, who did what? But what they did catch Waterfield on was Barbara Ann Byers and Angelica Lavalle. And they got him convicted on manslaughter for the murder of Lynn Elliott, whose body they found in the trunk of the Gore's car, dead from gunshot wounds. So she's the hero in this story. She finally stopped these cousins from hunting women in Indian River County and other towns around Florida. A lot of the police say that they believe that there could be as many as 20 victims. We don't know. Waterfield has never spoken about that or admitted to anything. And we're going to be certainly discussing my correspondence with Waterfield and his take on his innocence.